Well, hello and welcome to our virtual field trip to Bohm Woods today, and I'm going to start off by introducing you to Debbie Newman, who is a Natural Area Specialist with the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, and she's going to tell you a little bit about what the Commission is and what they do and what nature preserves and other protected areas are in Illinois. So I'm going to hand over to Debbie.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission is a small agency with a very big mission in Illinois. We have been around since 1963, so we're talking about 57 years now. And the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission was the first of its kind in the United States in terms of having a very efficient and successful system to protect high-quality natural areas. So the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission has a system of nature preserves and land and water reserves. So these are permanently protected areas in the state of Illinois. And Illinois Nature Preserves is the program that has been around the longest, clear back to the inception of the Nature Preserves Commission in the 1950s. And it is considered to be the highest form of land protection in the state of Illinois, and technically cannot be overturned even by eminent domain without a finding of imperative and unavoidable public necessity. So fortunately, in 57-year history of the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, so far we have never had a site overturned. So all of the 300 plus properties, lands that are in the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission system have remained protected for all of these years. So a little bit about how we have come to find areas that are qualifying for nature preserves. There was an inventory done in the 1970s called the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, and that was also the first of its kind in the United States. There was a statewide comprehensive effort to locate, classify, and catalog the remaining high-quality natural areas that we have in Illinois. So these would be areas that looked something like what our ancestral pioneers would have seen whenever they came into Illinois a few hundred years ago. And so when that inventory, that 3-year inventory was concluded, they found only 0.07% of the state was considered to be in a high-quality state. So again, relatively undisturbed by human activities and so forth. And so this inventory has become the basis of the work that the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission does in terms of protecting lands. That's the focus. And Bohm Woods that we're in today is one of those areas that was recognized on the original Illinois Natural Areas Inventory in the late 1970s. And it was considered to be a grade A and B mesic upland forest and dry mesic upland forest. And so, so these areas are basically very unique, considered rare in the state of Illinois, and when we have the opportunities to be able to protect them, we're protecting them for all time with a very ironclad system for future generations to be able to benefit from, and in the cases of public preserves to be able to come out and actually enjoy.
So here's the main sign at the parking lot at Bohm Woods, and it tells you a little bit about the fact that it's a nature preserve and what that means. And this basically means that it's fully protected. You can't take anything out, like plants or animals or fungi or anything else. Visitors are welcome, but only to enjoy nature, not to take anything.
So in my job as an Illinois Nature Preserves Commission Natural Areas Preservation Specialist, which I've been doing this job now for 24 years, I love this work. We work with landowners that own these high quality areas on potential partnership to protect those areas. So working with them if they have an interest in making their land a nature preserve. So that's a big part of my job, doing that. And so it's a lot of, you sit down at the kitchen table with people and talk about the importance of their land and preservation aspects, and ask them about things that they, goals that they might have for their property. So then another big part of my job is doing the stewardship, the management of the properties that we enroll into our nature preserve or land and water reserve or natural heritage landmark programs. And I will say that over the course of my career, our management has changed some because specifically of the explosion of exotic invasive species, non-native species that have come into virtually every preserve that we have. And so we're standing here at the edge of the Bohm Nature Preserve. This is a private site, and as the Natural Areas Preservation Specialist, I work on the private sites with the management more directly. The sites that are owned by the state, by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, the natural heritage biologist does that management more directly. So a little bit about the history of the Bohm Woods Nature Preserve Complex that we have here. So as I mentioned in about the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, this entire woodland area, about close to 100 acres, was recognized on the inventory as high quality forest in Illinois. And so basically back in 1982, this was owned by the Bohm family for generations. As often happens with family farms, they protected the woods, and they considered the area to be sort of an investment in the bank, but they didn't really want to log it unless they ever had to log it. And fortunately for all of us, they did not ever do a timber harvest in here, so we still have an opportunity today to see large trees, which is increasingly rare opportunity for Illinoisans to have. So currently we're standing in the Illinois Department of Natural Resources owned Bohm Woods Nature Preserve. There are actually 4 preserves here. So there's this one owned by IDNR, and then there are 3 private owned preserves: the Bohm Memorial Nature Preserve, the Toadwood Scrubs Nature Preserve, and the William and Emma Bohm Nature Preserve. And collectively they comprise more than 100 acres here of forest. So how this came to be was that back in the early 1980s, my predecessor, Judy Faulkner, had worked with Mrs. Bohm, this is going back a couple of generations, and she owned what is now the William and Emma Bohm Nature Preserve. And at the time, Judy had been working with her about trying to protect some of this forest permanently and legally, as is done with Illinois nature preserves. And so Mrs. Bohm wasn't sure she wanted to do that, but then eventually there was actually an issue that arose, which was that there was a proposal to put a water line through her woods. And she did not want to see that water line go through the woods at all. And so she had made the decision to go ahead and go forward with doing a nature preserve, because she knew that that was going to protect her land from a water line or any other potential impact to the property. So at that time, that was actually the very first privately owned dedicated nature preserve in the state of Illinois. So then subsequent to that, and years later, the niece to Mrs. Bohm, I believe it's the niece, decided to dedicate the Bohm Memorial. Okay, so and Bohm is the woman who had dedicated the William and Emma Bohm Nature Preserve. So then that was done, I believe, in the late 80s, early 90s. And then the Kendall family, who owned what is now the Toadwood Scrubs Nature Preserve, had decided that they wanted to also participate in this protection of this beautiful area, and they approached Judy Faulkner, my predecessor, about dedicating their property. So then fast forward to, I believe it was the late 1990s, early 2000s, I don't have the exact date right in front of me, that the Bohm family still held this large 92-acre parcel that we're standing in right now. And they wanted to sell it and they didn't want to sell it for development. They wanted to sell it for protection, but I believe at the time there wasn't any good opportunities for acquiring it, but we ended up having a mitigation settlement from an issue that had occurred in this region, and the mitigation money for that went through the Attorney General's office was used to help the Illinois Department of Natural Resources acquire this parcel, the Bohm family. Upon acquisition of the parcel, it was then dedicated as a nature preserve as well. So this is often how land conservation works for practitioners such as myself, is that you have a landscape that you want to protect, and of course in Illinois, large landscapes are becoming intact. I should say large, intact, ecologically intact landscapes are becoming very rare. But when we have those, we try to do our best working over the years to find solutions to get the various pieces of a large landscape that's intact protected. And this is a very good example of how all of this came to be here. And we're not completely done here. We want to work with some additional people around the area where there's a few pieces of woods, although not high quality woods, they're still considered to be important buffer from development for this particular nature preserve complex. So one thing I wanted to talk about is the quantity of forests, and specifically high quality forests, that we have left in the state of Illinois. Illinois is 49th out of the 50 United States in the amount of total natural land that we have left. So we're not doing too well here. So it's really critical for us to preserve as many pieces of high quality forest as possible. And to give you a little bit of a closer illustration of that, here in Illinois, prior to European settlement, we had approximately 14 million acres. So about 30-some-odd% of the state was forested. Today we have 4.6 million acres of forest land left in Illinois. However, out of those 4.6 million, much of that forest is very degraded today. And on the Illinois Natural Areas Inventory, ultimately we found about 11,000 acres of the 4.6 million that was considered to be high quality, aka grade A or grade B forest. And so that basically means that that's less than 0.2%, thus illustrating further the importance of protecting places like Bohm Woods. And then talking about Madison County here specifically. Excuse me, Madison County right now is 13% forested. So about 63,000 acres of the entire county is forested here. That's down 40% from 200 years ago. And Bohm Woods is the only grade A and grade B forest in all of Madison County. And in the entire Metro East region, going clear down to Monroe County, St. Clair County, Madison County, this Metro East area, Bohm Woods is one of only 4 upland forests that is listed on the inventory as grade A or B. And out of those 4 forests, we've got parts of 2 of them protected. All of the Bohm Woods area that was identified on the Natural Areas Inventory is now protected, and then we have others, areas that are not protected that are listed on the inventory. So again, this illustrates the extreme importance of trying to protect these high quality natural areas for future generations, because if we don't, there literally will be no opportunity for anyone to come in and see large trees such as we see in the background here.
Okay, I'm going to introduce you to the characteristic tree of the Mesic upland forest, the forest that's on the moister slopes here at Bohm Woods. It's right behind me here. This is a red oak or northern red oak, Quercus rubra, and like all the oaks in the red oak group, its leaves have these pointy lobes, and you'll see that, I don't know if you can see, but the the pointed lobes of the leaves actually end almost in a hair. Okay, so that's a red oak leaf. And the acorns are quite large. There's one here. Right, quite a large acorn with a very shallow cap. And these are full of tannin as a preservative and to protect them. So the wildlife that feed on these will store these away. Squirrels will collect these up and store them away and let them go maybe even through winter. The tannin will gradually go away, and then they'll be a food source in late winter and early spring when there's nothing else around to eat. They can go back to their store and eat these. Okay, so if we pan up the trunk, you'll see that one of the ways to identify red oak, apart from the leaves and the acorns, is that the bark is like really hard and has these kind of shiny ridges that kind of remind me of the ripples that you see in the sand down at the beach as you look up. This is a big tree here. We might measure this one. Okay, so we're going to measure this big northern red oak tree we were talking about. So this is a diameter tape which is calibrated to measure diameter when you wrap it around the tree. Andrew's going to hold that end of it. What have we got?
85 and a half.
85 and a half.
88.
Well, it's pretty close.
That's a really nice size for that.
70 to 80.
Oh.
So that's quite large. You don't find many red oaks around in this whole district that are anywhere near that big. So one of the characteristics of an old growth forest is really large trees, old trees, but also, as we saw, they don't live forever. Heart rot will weaken them. They'll get either snapped off or blown over in a windstorm, which we'll see some examples of, or they'll just die in place. And that's going to create big gaps in the canopy of the forest, which is going to allow light down to the lower level, and that's going to allow some species to regenerate. So this gap dynamics, as we call it, that's also a characteristic thing of an old growth forest, that as trees die and create gaps, smaller trees that were growing underneath will come up and claim those gaps.
So Peter was just talking about this magnificent northern red oak that we have here. So another aspect of management of these sites is, if you look around on this forest floor, there are no red oak seedlings or saplings anywhere. We saw acorns, as Peter picked up, but these plants are either, the acorns are not germinating well, or they germinate and the seedlings can't really survive. And one of the big reasons for that is we're having a major conversion of eastern United States forests because we have taken fire out of the ecosystem for the last 70 years. And what happens with this is that these oak species, red oak, white oak, black oak, shingle oak, post oak, they all have very thick bark. They're very tolerant to fire. Species such as sugar maple has very thin bark and is not tolerant to fire. So the fire in past history kept the sugar maple at bay. Sugar maple is a native species and part of this ecosystem, and especially in these more mesic slopes, but it wouldn't have been as dominant as it is today. And so the fire would have kept this plant at bay, especially these young ones, as you can see all through the forest here, and then would have allowed for there to still be sunlight coming down into the forest floor so that the oaks could survive. And so the oaks, as I was saying before, they're very tolerant of fire. Sugar maple is not. So we've taken fire out of the system, and then we're having this conversion to mesic species dominated even on dry south and west facing slopes, not even in addition to in places like this. So, and as I was saying earlier, the oak needs sunlight. Maple can survive very well in shade. So that's why we're not getting oak seedlings surviving under the dense shade of these maples. So one of the things that we do in management, and the natural heritage biologist who does work similar to me, they tend to manage the state sites more, the state-owned nature preserves. He would come in here at some point and try to reintroduce fire to the site, and then if needed, which maybe would be further needed here, would be to come in and do some mechanical thinning of the maples to get a little bit of sunlight in patches, especially around mother trees like this that are producing acorns and should be having seedlings coming up. I did see one, I've actually lost where it's at now, but I did see one white oak seedling in here. Oh, there it is right there. But literally, there are no other oak seedlings or saplings in this entire immediate area. So what's going to happen ecologically is that if we don't come in and do some specific management to help reverse the trend, these oaks will eventually die, and then you're going to have a completely different forest that's dominated by maple. And of course we know maple doesn't support the wildlife species near as well as the oak trees for the reasons that Peter was just mentioning with the acorns and the importance to wildlife for a food source.
Okay, so this big tree here behind me is an American basswood, Tilia americana, and that's also a characteristic species of the mesic upland forest on the slopes here at Bohm Woods. This is a really large tree. I'm going to pan up and look at the leaves are already turning yellow and falling off, but the leaves are kind of, I'll get a dead one off the ground here, partially dead. This is a basswood leaf, kind of almost heart-shaped with a real pointy tip and a serrated edge, but the base is asymmetric. It goes down on one side and up on the other side, and a very long petiole, almost as long as the lamina or leaf blade. Okay, I wanted to show you one of the interesting species that we find in the woods here. This is a small tree, commonly known as pawpaw. That's Asimina triloba, and these are very large leaves for a species in this kind of temperate zone that we live in. They're more like the kind of leaves you'd see down in the tropics, and in fact pawpaw belongs to a tropical family, the Ananaceae. Most of its relatives live down in tropical areas of Central and South America. So what's it doing up here? Here's its fruit, by the way. The pawpaws, kind of the size of a small fat banana, with a really nice tropical fruit flavour. There's a relative of this that's sold in supermarkets, much larger than this, not commonly called a custard apple, which is also in the same family. So pawpaw's relatives migrated across the Panama land bridge when that formed, some people say about 3.5 million years ago. Migrated across and moved up through North America, its ancestor did, and as it did, it evolved into this temperate species that we have. There are several species of in this genus down in Florida, but this is the only one that comes this far north and has become a temperate deciduous plant. So it's about to drop its leaves in the fall. It'll be leafless all winter, and then in the spring its flowers will come out before the leaves, and they're very stinky, and they'll be pollinated by flies and maybe beetles, and then later on it will form these big fruits. Okay, so you can see that they get quite tall. I guess these ones here are 30 to 40 feet tall, about 10 metres tall. Easy to recognise because of their very smooth bark on their trunks, the smooth grey bark, and those giant leaves that we're looking at. Okay, so what we're looking at here is one of the native shrubs, spice bush, Lindera benzoin, and it's really shiny red berries that it has in the fall. And it's called spice bush because if you crush up a leaf, it's got a very nice sweet spicy odour to it. This is one of the native shrubs that we want to encourage, and one of the things that would be competing with introduced shrubs like the bush honeysuckle.
So another aspect of keeping the forests a little bit open in terms of keeping fire in the forest ecosystem once in a while is that we have a really rich herbaceous layer in these forests, and so we're not only trying to promote oak recruitment, but we're also trying to promote the perpetuation of these herbaceous species such as the bellwort that we have here, the wild ginger colony that we have here, and a lot of other spring species, but even more importantly, as we continue to go up the slope, I know in some different places we have some of the summer herbaceous species that need to have some sun.
Okay, well here we are in Bohm Woods, in the old growth part of the woods, and we're up on the top of a loess ridge. Loess is the windblown sediment that the whole woods is on here, sediment from the Pleistocene that was blown in under cold and dry conditions from the Mississippi Valley. So there's no bedrock here unless you get right down through this sediment. It's at least maybe 50 feet thick here. So right behind me, in this dry mesic upland forest, one of the characteristic species is the white oak tree, Quercus alba, and this is a nice specimen here. We'll see if we can zoom in here. The leaves of the white oak are lobed, and they have these round lobes. And then here is white oak acorn. Okay, so the white oak acorns are not very well protected by tannins, so they're the ones that the wildlife use straight away. They're sweet. They don't store these away, they usually eat these straight away in the fall. So characteristic trees other than the white oak, we're going to walk around and look at some, but we'll see that there's another oak, the chinkapin oak. There's white ash, probably the tallest trees, and also there are, what else did we see up here? Well, there's some sugar maple. Here we have another large characteristic tree of the dry mesic forest. So this one's another oak. This is chinkapin oak, Quercus muhlenbergii, and this one, it's in the red oak group. These are some examples of its leaves, and you'll see that they're quite variable, but they all have this serrated, like sawtooth edge on them. Okay, and they're also very different colour on each side. So these have started changing to their fall colours, but normally they're dark green on top, and the bottom, I'll just turn a few of them over, the bottom is much paler, almost white in colour. So when you look up from the ground you see the white bottoms of the leaves. So here's some, whoops, it's coming out of its cap. These are acorns from the chinkapin oak, and you can see they're quite small, and the cap comes about halfway up, and these are also wildlife food as well. They're eaten by things like deer and squirrels and turkeys as well. There's a nice big tree, one of the tallest ones in just around where we are here. And here's one of the other characteristic big trees on this dry mesic forest. This one is a white ash, Fraxinus americana, and you can recognise that from these big long grooves in the bark. So these are probably the tallest trees in this part of the forest. We can't really show you the leaves because they've already started to drop, and they're pinnate leaves with leaflets coming out each side, and they've already kind of disintegrated, but the leaflets are all over the ground here. So these ash trees are threatened by an introduced insect which is just arriving in this district, the emerald ash borer, and it's predicted that within a few years all these trees will be dead, and clearly that's going to cause big changes in forests like this. So we've been talking about this forest, and I think I've mentioned a few times that it's, the type of forest is generally classified as oak hickory forest, and we've seen several different oaks as we've walked around. Here's a hickory behind me. This particular one is shagbark hickory, Now, I always get, someone's going to have to correct me here, it's the species, it's Caria, which one is it? Is it tomentosa?
I think it's tomentosa.
Yeah, I think it's Caria tomentosa. Shagbark hickory. You can see where it got its name shagbark from the bark peels off in these big shags that kind of hang down. So hickories have large seeds like oaks do, and hickory nut, this is one off the shagbark, so it's surrounded by a kind of an outer part that breaks off, and inside is the actual nut. Okay, so that's contains one very large seed, which is very good wildlife food, just like acorns are. I think we've found 5 or 6 species of hickories in this forest. So the hickories have compound leaves. This is a leaf off that shagbark hickory. You can see it has 5 leaflets, this one. A pair there, another pair, and one on the end. Okay, and so all hickories have these compound leaves like that. Okay, so this is a standing dead tree, and it's broken off, so it's not very tall. There's the top of it, but notice that it's been consumed by saprophytic fungi. This bracket here, I'll zoom in on it. Okay, so that's just the fruiting body of a fungus whose filaments are like all through that wood, digesting it. Okay, so here we have what used to be quite a large white oak tree, which is clearly broken off and fallen down. This is just the stump here. This is characteristic of an old growth forest, that when trees get really old, they're more likely to have heart rot, fungus that kind of hollows them out. And this makes them susceptible when there's a windstorm to getting snapped off and blown over. This is one thing, this is a snap off, and I think you just saw the big trunk lying on the ground. So now this is habitat for all kinds of things that can use this kind of rotting and decaying wood, and especially fungi that are going to eat the lignin out of this. But also, once the wood starts to break down, lots of insects get into that wood. There's all kinds of hollows in there for mammals to live in and things like that. One of the things that can happen to an old tree is that they can be quite shallow rooted in this loose soil, and in a windstorm they can just be blown over, and that's what's happened to this white oak here. So you can see here's the root system, and what I'm standing in is the pit that's left where the roots used to be. And this topography of pits and then the mound of soil next to it is a classic old growth forest feature as well. This varied microtopography creates different microhabitats for plants to grow in. And there's an even better example just over here. So Andrew is standing in the pit there of what looks like it might have been a white ash that fell over there, and you can see all the soil that used to be on its roots is going to form that big mound there next to the pit. So you've got a relatively dry microsite next to a relatively moist one there for different seedlings to come up in.
So we have different methods of trying to eradicate or control bush honeysuckle, which I tend to call the cancer of the woods in Illinois in 2020. So one of the ways that is very easy to control if you don't have huge infestations or you don't have really concentration of large bushes is to simply pull out the seedlings and the medium-sized bushes, because bush honeysuckle is very shallow rooted, as you can see. So this is a pretty good sized bush, and I was able to pull this out with my own muscles, and it's very easy to control that, and also to use that if you do an initial treatment of larger bushes, to come back in and try to keep up with the management over the years in the future with pulling up seedlings and saplings, so it doesn't ever get back to the point of having large bushes. When you have large bushes that you have to deal with, there are different methods to use that we employ for trying to control honeysuckle. One of them can be a foliar application where you come in with a backpack sprayer in November, when you would not be killing native plants, because the native plants go dormant the honeysuckle stays green until usually about mid-December. So there's a small window of opportunity that you can get in and you can do a foliar spray that's very effective and not having residual effects on native plants. That can also be done aerially, which we occasionally do. It's a very cheap way to do it, but we only do that if we have a very large landscape or a very steep landscape that's difficult to access. Another way is to come in with a brush saw or brush cutter, which looks like a weed whacker but has a brush blade on the end, a saw blade. And you come in with those and they have handlebars like a bicycle, and you go in and you whack off the stems, and then someone has to come in and follow up and squirt the stumps. Now when you have large infestations in areas that are not the highest quality, so right now we're standing at the very edge of Bohm Woods Nature Preserve, and this area is more disturbed, probably had a grazing history because of all of this. We can tell that by this white snake root, a plant that would not have been eaten a lot by cattle. So a lot of times when this is the dominant plant that remains, we have some kind of a clue that there was some grazing that had occurred. So this part of Bohm Woods, right up by the parking lot, is considered a little bit more degraded, and it was a solid stand of bush honeysuckle. So Mark Phillips, the natural heritage biologist, had a contract to come in here with a brush mower, fecon head type of piece of equipment on a skid steer, where it basically comes in and chops up all of the bush honeysuckle. And then you get some resprouts like you have here, and then once the native plants have died back, the biologist will come in and then foliar spray these. It's very easy to come in with just a few of these scattered around with a backpack sprayer and come in and squirt a 2% Roundup foliar spray on those seedlings that are coming back up, or those resprouts that come back up from the brush hogging with the fecon type mower in these kinds of areas. So we really have to use a variety of tools to be able to control invasive species in these high quality areas. And the nature preserves, because they are considered the best last high quality areas that we have in Illinois, we do have a very specific set of rules that we have to follow in terms of how we apply management to the properties. And everything has to be approved with a management plan. So another part of my job and the natural heritage biologist's job is to write up a management plan and then update it every 5 years with the activities that we're going to do, such as prescribed fire, controlling specific invasives, trying to remove some maple trees so that we can get more oak species germinating and growing in the understory.
Yeah, you can see how open this understory area is now after all the honeysuckle was removed. It used to literally be a thicket of honeysuckle up above your head. So here's bush honeysuckle, and so to identify it, it's got opposite leaves, and notice the leaves are in pairs, and the leaves are quite thin and they come to a very tapering point, and they also feel a little bit kind of rough to the feel. Alright, and then in fall, if we pan up there, we can see it's loaded with these red berries. So this plant was deliberately introduced into the United States as a horticultural plant. People like to grow it in their gardens. When it's flowering, it has these nice fragrant white flowers on it, and then in fall it has these shiny red berries. I believe it was given away at the World Fair in St. Louis in pots, and people planted it in their gardens. And now birds, of course, eat these fruit and spread the seeds around, and they can spread them over long distances. And so that's why it's always an ongoing battle against honeysuckle, because once you remove it by some of the methods we were talking about, that Debbie was talking about before, birds are going to bring it back in. Even if you kill all the little ones that are sprouting up, it can still come back in. Okay. So as you can see by this sign here, that part of the management of Bohm Woods nature preserve is that hunting is allowed here to try to control the deer population. From October the 1st through to late January every year there's an archery hunting. I think it's a lottery system where they allocate the licence to like 2 people per week to hunt, and you're only allowed to use archery, there's no shooting allowed. This is, you can see why we're actually doing this now and not in October. We can't go in there during October, even we're in orange like this, it would be dangerous. But anyway, that's part of the management. See, the white-tailed deer populations in many parts of Illinois are way too high. That includes SIUE campus. And when the deer population is too high, they tend to overbrowse tree seedlings and prevent the regeneration of trees. They also really hammer the non-woody vegetation. The spring wildflower communities get really eaten out and lose diversity if the deer population is too high. Okay, so I'm standing here on the very edge of Bohm Woods next to New Pogue Road. That you can probably hear the traffic noise. And just behind me is the edge of the woods, but this is not old growth woods here. This is a little fringe of young forest that's developed along the edge of the forest in the last, say, 40 years or so. And so these trees here are not really old trees. These are trees of fast growing species like there's elm, there's silver maple, there'd be things like redbud and hackberry and black locust tree. Okay, so this is kind of a fringe of this regrowth forest along the edge. And if we pan around this way, you'll see that not all of the nature preserve is actually forest. There's areas like behind me here that was a cornfield but has been temporarily restored to a tallgrass prairie using a seed mix. And so we've got big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, and a few forbs. You can see some goldenrod there. It's not terribly diverse, but at least it's back to being a native ecosystem, and maybe in the long term this site will be restored back to forest eventually.